So what do you focus on when you are preparing for an English assessment? So when you've got a maths assessment or something, sort of in that side of the, field, so to speak, you've got particular questions that you're working towards. You can look at the paper, you've got the questions, and you know what to focus on. One of the things I find a lot more difficult for English is that there's so much content and students often don't know what they need to be focusing on throughout the term so that when they get an assessment, they're actually ready for it. So the great thing is that there is actually very few things that English gets that actually gets assessed in English. So generally you're going to have, you're going to have essay writing, then you've got your sort of creative, discursive, persuasive, reflection component, you've got comprehension, and then for an assessment at some point you'll have like a multimodal, which is basically an essay with more conversational language, but it's an analysis of a particular text. The actual analysis in the multimodal is exactly the same as an essay in terms of looking at the techniques and how they link to a certain effect and what have you. So when you're going to be preparing for English, I want to kind of give you some like pointers on how to create your own questions, or how to know what sort of questions they're always going to ask, especially when it's going to be an essay under exam conditions, which can be one of the hardest types of assessments, because you've got to sort of know what to learn, or learn a certain amount of material, quotes, what have you, and then be able to sort of apply them under exam conditions. And what often happens is students just learn a bunch of quotes, usually to do with particular themes, and never actually practice doing a question under exam conditions, but even a question to begin with, because it's like, oh, well, they could ask anything. There's always this thing of English, they can ask anything. Let me tell you, they can't ask anything. They have to ask you something to do with your text. And there's a particular style of question that gets asked, particularly for the New South Wales syllabus. So I'm going to share this document with you. Share that one. And this is going to give you a framework in terms of knowing what sort of questions they can actually ask you, and therefore what you need to prepare. Okay, so the first type of question you can get is they'll ask you about a key theme from your text, right? So I'm going to use Macbeth as an example. So it would be something like, central to the text Macbeth by Shakespeare is the theme of ambition, and you could substitute that with really any of the themes that you've got there: loyalty, supernatural powers, something to do with, it could also be something to do with the context, right? So it reflects the, values or ideas of the context. Okay, so that's the first style of question you could get. The next one, and actually this isn't different from the first one, but they're very keen on asking to what extent questions. And it's really easy to answer this part of the question, but so many people just forget about it. So, and all you really need to do is like have a stance towards the question. So if they're asking you about ambition, you would say, it is central to some extent. However, and then maybe you want to say something else about it, like, anyway, there could be something else that you want to say, right, outside of ambition. So just make sure that you've got the actual words to some extent, to a large extent, etc. Okay, so that's a really common one you'll see. The next one is that you might have a quote about the text, such as from a critic or someone who states something about the text itself, or a key idea in the text. Okay, so like for a comparative essay, something like a quote: the more things change, the more they stay the same. To what extent do you agree with this statement when exploring the connections between this text and that text? Okay, so that's an example of where you might get a quote where you have to sort of make sure that you integrate that. So what people often do is, if they don't, like here, I've actually got here, to what extent do you agree? So you're really going to have to use that quote. Sometimes they say that, and then they have a question here that seems like it's almost got nothing to do with that actual quote, right? So it just says something like, by comparing the two texts set for study, discuss the similarities and differences, let's say, or the connections, or how it's mirrored, and how they conflict with each other. At that point, then sometimes students then don't use this part: the more things change, the more they stay the same. But you really should still use that, because the more opportunities you have to show that you've answered the question, the higher your mark is going to be. Okay, so do not miss or ignore opportunities to do that. The next style of question is an extract-based question. But this has become a lot more common in the new syllabus because it's really the best way to show that you actually really understand this text that they've given you. Because if they throw you as, you know, like a stanza or like a section of the text itself that you probably haven't necessarily got like a prepared essay on or whatever, then you have to be able to think on the spot, which means you have to be able to really understand what your ideas are and what the actual argument is that you're going to have. Okay, so when you're going to do an extract-based question, and if you want to create one of those yourself, by the way, the best thing to do is either take the beginning few lines of the text or the final few lines. I actually prefer the final few lines because I feel like there's usually a bit more sort of being summed up right at the end. And, you know, and I've seen it's just more common that you do get it sort of at the end, right? Because again, like it's sort of coming to a conclusion and wrapping everything up. Okay. You know, or it could be a key quote or passage from the text. So for, say, Shakespeare plays, everyone does Shakespeare, so I, you know, like using those as examples. Picking a key passage or part of a soliloquy, let's say, where, you know, then there's that focus on, you know, being able to sort of break that down and use that in your response. So I'm going to give you some tips on how to do the extract-based questions, because I think in terms of actually showing you fully integrated it, like it's important that you have a couple of key things in there. So the first thing is, you know, yes, treat the extract same way as a normal question. And what I mean by that is, you know, normally when you get a question, like if you had this one, you know, the more things change, the more they say the same, you should always underline the keywords of the question. You know, so underline, and then think of a synonym for those words so that you can then have a better chance of incorporating it well into your argument. I do have other videos about that, but I won't go into heaps of detail there now. But with this extract, actually, probably rather than necessarily treating it like a normal question, treat it like a comprehension. So when you're reading a comprehension, the text there, you should be thinking, like, while you're, I mean, you can't always have a pen because you might be in reading time, but you want to really be looking for the techniques, like looking for the meaning behind the actual technique. So just put aside what you prepared, have a look at the actual text in front of you, and then find the techniques. Okay, and then find and think about what that particular extract is communicating. That's the first step. So sometimes it can be overwhelming going, oh my gosh, I've got all this prepared and oh, this extract is saying something else. Like, how do I bring these both together? Just put your stuff aside. You've done that work. So really, when you get an extract, you should know what it's saying, but you have to be able to make the connection between what you know and what they've given in front of you. And I know you're under the pump in terms of time, so that makes it even more challenging, but that's why it's even more important to do it when you're not in exam conditions. Okay, so you know, thinking about what that extract actually means. Then after you do that, then you can start thinking about how that connects with your other material. Okay. Then you need to refer to the stimulus in the introduction. Okay. So like, what's that extract saying? What did you come up with in terms of like evaluating the purpose of that particular extract? Okay. You don't need to quote the extract in the introduction, but you should mention how it's relevant. Okay, so in the extract given, it is evident that ambition is central, let's say, going back to that one, or, you know, the extract given reveals the, you know, the central character Macbeth struggling with, you know, his ambition to become king, which conflicts with the paradigms or values of, you know, the Elizabethan era. You know, because obviously, you know, him wanting to become king is breaking the chain of being. So, you know, that's just an example of how you can sort of make reference to the extract, but not necessarily quote it. And it's given the marker the opportunity to see that you've actually really thought about the extract, as opposed to what normally happens, ignoring most of it, or ignoring the extract, or not mentioning it until you actually start quoting from it. So then you just go like at whatever part of the essay, let's say it's the middle paragraph where you're going to be going into an in-depth analysis with this particular quote. By the way, try to talk about the extract first, because that's where you're going to get the most marks by actually showing that you've really done that. That doesn't always work if, say, for example, they've given you an extract from the end of the text. It might be a bit weird to talk about that in the first paragraph, but it's still good for you to mention where you're going to do it. So like if the extract was from the end of the text, in the introduction, that's where the value is in being able to introduce how the extract is relevant, because you can say that in the introduction and then they know, okay, you're going to be talking about it towards the end, but you haven't just left it all together. And then at some point when you use quotes from the actual extract, you're just hoping that the teacher notices, right? It needs to be a very intentional mention of this is the extract and how it's relevant. And then when you get into your essay, you can mention that again. So again, when you're quoting from the extract, don't just quote and think the teacher should just know what it is, okay? Think about from the teacher's perspective, the marker's perspective, they've got heaps of papers to write. You know, they might miss it. You don't want them that to happen, right? Because they are going to have to skim to some degree, right? So make sure that when you do use a quote, you say, as evident in the extract given, comma, here's the quote, right? Like, here's what you want to say about it, okay? So that's really important in your essay. And then use as many quotes from the extract as possible. Prioritize quotes from the extract over the ones you have prepared. Okay, best case scenario, you get to use the quotes in the extract in every paragraph at least once. That is best case scenario. Next best case scenario is that you use it in the first paragraph, but if you really can't figure out how to do that on the spot based on the extract they've given, at least make that mentioned in the introduction. And again, when you do that breakdown initially of how to use the extract, like ideally you should be able to substitute quotes you've prepared for quotes they've given, okay? And be really like conscious about making that choice, because if they see the quote from the extract, you're definitely going to get a higher mark, right? Rather than using your own one and going, oh yeah, that's pretty much, what the stimulus said as well. It needs to be very, very clear for the marker that that's what you've actually done. So hopefully that helps you in terms of understanding what types of questions to expect for the New South Wales English curriculum. You're never going to get things like, tell me about a plot. Sometimes you could get asked about a character, but you generally, if that is the case, it'll probably be a main character. And then they'll tell you to talk about that character in relation to the play as a whole, which means you can bring other characters in as well, because, no character or theme happens in a vacuum. They're all interrelated to each other, okay? So if you can think about how they're all connected, you'll have a much better, I suppose, thesis, or like you'll be much better prepared to answer the questions that are given. But anyway, these are the styles of the question. So hopefully that helps in terms of, if you don't have a past paper, knowing how to create questions for yourself so that you can really practice those before you get under exam conditions.